I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the landscape, the child protection landscape nationally, drill down a little bit to Minnesota, and talk a bit about the child welfare reform efforts that have occurred here in Minnesota. Nationally, over 3 million reports of child maltreatment occur each year, and less than 30% of those are substantiated. They're found to be true. I think that's an important thing to note, because most of us are exposed to child protection issues through high-profile failed cases that appear in the newspaper and the media. And those represent a very small fraction of the work of child protection. Much of the work is making assessments or investigations of families to see how the family's functioning and whether there is a need for intervention. Most of those families, there's not child maltreatment occurring. There may be many risks there that need to be attended to, but less than 30% of those are founded. And it goes to how we treat those families. If we treat them all as if maltreatment is occurring, we do a disservice to them, and I think that's where reform has been moving in the past 10 years. It's also important to note that of that 3 million plus reports, over 2/3 of those are for neglect, for the lack of food, clothing, shelter, basic needs, education, health care. It's not about sexual abuse or physical abuse, although that's significant. Primarily, it's about the lack of resources. Periodically, the federal government does something called a national incidence study, in which they look at what's the incidence of child maltreatment. And they have rigorously tied the likelihood of child maltreatment to the level of income within families. So that if your income is below that of the federal poverty level, you're over 40 times more likely to be reported for child neglect than if your income is twice the poverty level. And those of you know what the poverty level is, even at twice, it's a very modest income. So if you're below that, so poverty, neglect are tied together, and that's an important thing to note when we look at what are the kinds of interventions that should occur. When you look at Minnesota, Minnesota does something like 18,000 investigations, assessments of child maltreatment each year. Those are done by the counties. Minnesota is a state-supervised, county-administered system. Each of the 87 counties has a way of responding to all social services, including child welfare and child protection. The counties also pay the largest cost of child welfare services. It's, as Judge Loeffler identified, the loss of income now to counties is having a dramatic effect on their ability to deliver services, and it bears heavily on the counties. The federal government is next, and the state of Minnesota is the least amount of investment in that, something around between 14 and 16% of the funding. Over 50% is for the local county. Even the federal dollars that are provided are for deep end services, the kinds of cases that come to court because children are at such risk that they're unable to stay in their own parents' home. Very little is put up front for families, even though we know that lack of resources is the primary driver of much of child protection work. So, given that most reports are not substantiated, less than 30%, and that lack of resources, not lack of parent interest, not lack of parent character, not lack of desire, causes the neglect issues for many families, and that the very act of being investigated is disruptive and adversarial. It's threatening to families. Is there a better system that we can deal with? Judge Loeffler, in our talking, said, I introduced myself as a child protection manager, and he said, you're from the evil empire, which is, and I understand because most of the families that have to deal with child protection have been disenfranchised, don't participate even when the economy is going well, less so during the current times. Their children are their greatest resource, and child protection is a threat to that. And so, and often the intervention's not helpful for them. And again, remember that less than 30% of those families, there's a finding of child maltreatment. So this very scary intervention, affects those families, and then you walk away. So is there a better way to do work? 9 years ago, the legislature in Minnesota allowed counties to do something which was called alternative response, an alternative to the traditional investigation. And the traditional investigation is a forensic-style approach to working on incidents of child maltreatment, where child protection workers have to make two decisions. Did maltreatment occur or not, which involves interviewing the family, interviewing witnesses, gathering testimony, and then making a decision based on the preponderance of evidence. Did maltreatment occur or not? And then the second decision that they make is are services needed or not? Now remember, this is a very difficult, emotionally grueling for the social worker as well as for the family activity, and produces about, I think the national standard is 29% of the cases are substantiated. Is there a better way of doing business? And the legislature said, well, we're going to allow counties who want to set aside this fault-finding process, this adversarial process, and focus in on safety. That's still the primary business of child protection, is to make sure children are safe. To focus on safety and the delivery of resources, especially around those cases in which the lack of resources is the kind of causal line for the neglect and maltreatment of the child. 20 counties agreed to do this. Those 20 counties included the large counties like Hennepin and Ramsey, most of the metro counties, and a number of the greater Minnesota counties. And we followed those families for 4 years. And we did a very rigorous evaluation of this alternative approach where you set aside the fault finding, engage the family in the process of what do they need, and delivering those services up front. So we follow them. The families that were eligible for this approach, which were cases that did not involve substantial child endangerment, there still are children who need just a very aggressive response. Those are cases of sexual abuse, severe physical abuse, abandoned children, shaken babies, failure to thrive. But they account for a very small part of the work, but those are still done through a very aggressive investigation. The families who didn't have those allegations were randomly assigned by a computer to either get business as usual, an investigation, or family assessment that were services loaded. And then we followed those families for 4 years, thousands of families for 4 years. And this is what we found. When you delivered services up front, families were less likely to come back into the system. There's recidivism rate dropped significantly, less likely to come back. When you deliver services up front, you lower placement costs. The likelihood of a child is going to be moved outside of the family and placed, and that's very costly. Out-of-home placement is very costly. You improve family and child well-being. This idea of focusing only on the child and not the child in context of the family really is not doable. You can't keep a child safe if their primary caregiver and their siblings are not safe. So you have to use the whole family is the target of services. We improve family well-being. Things like stable housing, increased income, less likelihood of domestic violence, less likelihood of chemical dependency. Children did better in school. All of those things improve child and family well-being. Higher rates of service satisfaction, which goes to the evil empire thought. Folks do say that this is a better approach. It's an approach that is less threatening and more helpful. They said that they were engaged, they were helped, it was meaningful. And here's the thing that even economists would like, and that is it costs less over time. It costs a bit more upfront to do this, to serve more families, to serve them more broadly, to focus on, and primarily the services weren't fixing the developmental failures of the parent. It was providing them with the basic needs to help them raise their children, food, clothing, shelter, those kinds of things. When we deliver those up front and then we followed families for 4 years, the families who got those services didn't come back. When they came back, didn't need deep end services, didn't need to be involved in expensive involvements, interventions with the system. And those who didn't came back more frequently. Their children were placed. the service interventions were costly, so that it was well over $1,000 average per family, that it costs more within this time period, and it continues to grow as we follow the families over time. So it's a better approach. So with that, I'll end. But I think you're hearing a theme here from the judge and from the economic point of view, that it's a good investment to get to families early, to provide services early, to provide the basic needs, and then we won't have the tragedies, at least not at the scale that we have now, later on. Thank you.